Russia just lost something it cannot afford to dismiss, and Israel is the one responsible, not in Syria, not in Lebanon, on the Caspian Sea, a body of water Moscow treats as its own sovereign territory. If you believe this situation stays contained, you have not studied the geography carefully enough. The port of Anzali, Iran's most critical gateway on the Caspian coastline, was just struck in an Israeli military operation. Western outlets covered it in a handful of sentences and moved on. That is a serious failure of context because what was targeted was not simply an Iranian port facility, it was a functioning supply corridor, connecting Russian military equipment to Iranian forces, and it's inside a body of water that Russia shares with Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and its own extended coastline. This is not the Persian Gulf, this is not the Red Sea. The Caspian is a closed, landlocked sea that Moscow has treated as strategically sovereign space for decades. Russian naval forces operate there. Russian military infrastructure encircles it, and the weapons, energy supplies, and critical materials flowing between Moscow and Tehran move directly through ports along that waterline. Anzali was the primary door through which that exchange happened. Israel just forced it open by destroying it. If this is the first time you are hearing that framing, that gap in your understanding is precisely what this analysis exists to close. Subscribe now and enable notifications. This channel covers what headline writers consistently leave behind. To fully grasp the significance of this strike, you need one piece of geographic context that most audiences have never encountered. The international north-south transport corridor known as the INSTC is a 7,200-kilometer trade route stretching from Mumbai in India, threading through Iran, crossing the Caspian Sea, continuing through Russia and extending northward into European markets. Independent assessments indicate it reduces transit time between India and Russia by roughly 40% compared to traditional Suez Canal routing. It cuts shipping costs by approximately 30%. Anzali is not a peripheral stop along that corridor. It is the principal Iranian gateway on the Caspian segment, handling container operations, bulk cargo storage, and dual-use logistics infrastructure developed through direct Russian-Iranian cooperation over many years. Then 2022 arrived. Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered the most sweeping Western sanctions architecture assembled since the Cold War. Both Moscow and Tehran responded by accelerating their use of the INSTC as a mechanism to route around those restrictions. Traffic volumes climbed steadily through 2023 and 2024. Port capacity was expanded, rail connections were upgraded, cross-Caspian ferry infrastructure was developed and reinforced. According to multiple Western intelligence assessments, Russian military technology, targeting data, and drone components have been flowing into active conflict theaters through supply channels running directly through this corridor. That is what Israel struck. Not a symbol, not a diplomatic gesture, a functioning artery carrying material that was actively shaping battlefield outcomes, and the consequences of severing that artery extend far beyond the port itself. There are two distinct ways to interpret the Anzali strike. The first is through pure military logic: destroy the logistics node, interrupt the pipeline, complicate the movement of Russian military technology into Iranian hands, calculated, aggressive, but strategically coherent within established frameworks of preventive military action. The second interpretation is considerably darker. What if the port facility was never the primary objective? What if the calculation made in Tel Aviv was to strike infrastructure so deeply embedded within Russian strategic space that Moscow cannot absorb the blow quietly and is therefore compelled into a response that draws it formally into the broader conflict? Because if Russia responds with direct military force against Israel, Article 5 of the NATO treaty becomes an active conversation overnight. The full architecture of Western collective defense gets pulled into a confrontation with Moscow that makes everything unfolding in the Persian Gulf appear minor by comparison, and Israel's position, which has faced mounting Western pressure over its military conduct, suddenly becomes inseparable from core Western existential interests in ways that make political distance from Tel Aviv functionally impossible. Independent strategic analysts have pushed back on this darker reading. Their counter-argument holds that Israeli strategic doctrine has consistently avoided actions that risk direct NATO-Russia escalation, precisely because the nuclear dimension of that scenario represents an existential threat that erases any conceivable tactical advantage. That is a reasonable position, but here is what both interpretations share as common ground. The Anzali strike represents a qualitative escalation beyond anything Israel has previously executed in this conflict. Someone at the highest level of decision-making authorized this operation. The central question is what response they anticipated receiving. Russia has not responded with military force. Do not interpret that restraint as weakness. Read it instead as a government methodically working through a menu of graduated responses capable of imposing far deeper and more durable costs than any single missile strike could achieve. The first available option is Syrian airspace. Russia controls the air defense environment over Syria and operates from Hamimam Air Base. It possesses the technical capability to deny Israeli aircraft access to Syrian airspace immediately. That option has never been exercised despite years of Israeli strikes conducted on Syrian territory. After Anzali, the political sustainability of that restraint is under serious pressure. The second option is the one that most fundamentally alters the conflict's character, the transfer of advanced surface-to-air missile systems to Hezbollah. The organization maintains a substantial missile arsenal but possesses limited sophisticated air defense capability. The introduction of advanced air defense platforms into southern Lebanon, not Russia's most capable systems, but sufficient, would transform the aerial environment over northern Israel in ways that Israeli Air Force operational doctrine has not been tested against during this conflict. International legal frameworks clearly prohibit the transfer of advanced weapons systems to non-state armed groups. Whether Moscow chooses to cross that line is now a genuinely open question. The third option involves deeper undeclared support for Iranian military operations. Russia has already been providing targeting intelligence and hardware through channels that are operationally significant without being formally acknowledged. Following Anzali, the volume and sophistication of that support can be quietly increased. In ways that produce visible battlefield effects within days, no announcement required, no treaty invoked, simply a recalibration of existing arrangements that carries immediate consequences. The fourth option involves applying commercial pressure on third parties through Caspian leverage. Russia holds substantial economic influence over both Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Both nations depend on Caspian transit infrastructure for the energy export revenues that underpin domestic stability, selectively disrupting those arrangements. As a pressure signal costs Israel nothing directly, but it fractures the regional network sustaining stability across Central Asia and delivers a clear message to every government observing this confrontation that proximity to this conflict carries a measurable price. 2 years ago, credible reporting indicated that Russia extended a formal mutual defense treaty offer to Iran structured so that an attack on either party would trigger a binding military obligation from the other, a direct functional equivalent of NATO's collective defense architecture, applied to what Washington describes as the axis of resistance. Iran declined, a reformist parliamentary faction, still holding on to the possibility of renewed Western engagement, blocked ratification. Their reasoning was not irrational given the information available at that moment. Accepting a formal defense commitment with Moscow would permanently foreclose any pathway back toward a negotiated arrangement with the West and lock Tehran inside Russian strategic orbit without an exit option. After Anzali, the internal political argument for refusing that treaty has been structurally dismantled. Iran has absorbed repeated strikes from both Israel and the United States. Russia has provided unofficial support without any formal obligation compelling it to do so, and now Israel has struck Russian-adjacent infrastructure with apparent impunity precisely because no binding defense commitment existed to deter it. The structural logic driving Tehran back toward that treaty conversation has fundamentally shifted, and the political conditions inside Iran for accepting it are now completely unrecognizable compared to what they were 24 months ago. That shift is not ideological. It is not a matter of preference or factional politics. It is the direct structural consequence of what the Anzali strike just altered on the strategic map. Step back from the port, step back from the Caspian coastline. Look at the entire board simultaneously. Iron Dome was presented to the world as a near-perfect defensive architecture. Iranian strike packages have penetrated it on multiple documented occasions, not because the system failed categorically, but because no air defense platform is absolute when the volume and variety of incoming threats crosses a critical threshold. The 12-day air campaign against Iran was framed publicly as a demonstration of overwhelming Israeli aerial superiority. What independent military analysis and investigative reporting actually reveal is a campaign that reached the boundaries of its achievable objectives by day 12, not day 13, not day 14. The public narrative and the operational reality were telling measurably different stories. Gaza remains unresolved. Hezbollah has inflicted genuine casualties along Israel's northern border. Houthi forces have constrained Israeli-linked commercial shipping through the Red Sea more effectively than every military strike conducted against Yemen has managed to reverse. Iran continues launching strikes, continues maintaining operational influence over the Strait of Hormuz, and has not experienced organizational collapse despite sustained and intensive military pressure from both Israel and the United States. Credible strategic institutions offer a legitimate counter-argument. Degrading an adversary's military capacity is a cumulative process, and the absence of visible collapse does not constitute evidence of failure. That argument carries genuine analytical weight. Strategic campaigns are rarely resolved within a single phase of operations. But here is what the broader pattern reveals. When a military actor that has historically operated within a defined geographic perimeter begins extending operations into the Caspian Sea, into Russian strategic space, into logistics corridors connecting Central Asian energy exporters to Northern European markets, that extension is not the behavior of an actor operating from a position of surplus options. It is the behavior of an actor searching for leverage that its existing toolkit has not successfully located. The INSTC corridor that Anzali anchors is not a bilateral arrangement confined to Russia and Iran. Kazakhstan ranks among the world's largest landlocked oil exporters. Azerbaijan moves substantial energy volumes through Caspian infrastructure. Both depend on corridor functionality for the revenues that sustain domestic political stability. Global energy markets were already operating near their pressure limits before the Anzali strike was executed. Every additional disruption introduced into a system already stretched close to its ceiling produces price signals that radiate outward: shipping costs, commodity prices, the cost of manufactured goods in markets geographically distant from the Caspian coastline. A port strike in northern Iran becomes a measurable factor in consumer prices far beyond the region through a chain of consequences that is real, documented, and almost never explained to general audiences. This is not a conclusion. This is the moment immediately preceding the next move on a board that just changed its fundamental shape. Russia will not answer with a direct military strike against Israel, not because the capability is absent, not because the provocation was insufficient, but because the graduated options available: airspace denial over Syria, advanced air defense transfers, enhanced material support for Iranian operations, Caspian commercial pressure on regional partners can impose costs that a single missile strike cannot match in either depth or duration. Russia has always played a long game. That strategic patience is not a characteristic, it is a doctrine. Watch therefore for advanced air defense signatures appearing in Lebanon that Hezbollah could not have generated from its own resources 18 months ago. Watch for the moment a system appears in the field whose origin traces back to a decision made in Moscow in the days immediately following Anzali. When that moment arrives, the Anzali strike will be understood not as an isolated military operation, but as the precise moment one strategic rulebook was closed and an entirely different one was opened in its place. The next move belongs to Moscow, and the options that nobody in mainstream analysis is currently discussing are exactly the ones most likely to materialize first. Subscribe to stay ahead of what develops, because it will develop. Drop your assessment in the comments below. What does Russia do next?